Hi there, welcome back to my channel, Fear Factory. I have a juicy one for you guys today. It's called The Shadowland Express from creepypasta.com, written by Mark Lynch. It is a top rated creepypasta on the website, so you know it will be good. I hope you guys enjoy. Part 1. The Train. I can't say why I was chosen to ride the Shadowlands Express. Why me, and not the countless others who have sinned during the mortal lives? Perhaps all will be forced to face their demons in the end. I can't say for sure, but clearly the odyssey I was thrust into was not of my choosing. I wouldn't have boarded the ghost train if I had known the horrors which lay before me, but despite the terrors I lived through and the people I've lost, I strangely feel like I'm a better man because of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There's not much I can tell you about myself. I'm not here to recount my life story. I've never thought of myself as a bad person, but I've done bad things which resulted in people getting hurt. I've worked in the corporate world for most of my life and never had a problem with screwing people over to advance my career. My company has a culture of working hard, playing hard, and I was one of the greatest proponents of this hedonistic lifestyle. On the fateful night when I boarded the express, I had been out on the town, partying, drinking hard before making a mad dash for the last train home. Honestly, I remember little about the sequence of events that night, as it all passed by in a drunken blur. I vaguely recall running through an abandoned train station, buying a paper ticket from a dead-eyed attendant, sprinting down the platform and jumping into the carriage mere seconds before the doors slammed shut. I was panting and sweating by the time I entered the nondescript train carriage, but I felt satisfied because I made it just in the nick of time. I remember smiling as I collapsed down upon a cushioned seat in an empty booth, hearing the whistle being blown as the train slowly pulled away from the platform, gaining speed as it exited the station and proceeded along the tracks. I felt exhausted at that moment, physically drained by the night of drinking and the dash to the carriage. I loosened my tie, wiped the sweat off my brow, and tried my best to keep my eyes open. I didn't want to fall asleep because then I'd surely miss my stop. But try as I might, I simply couldn't fight the overwhelming urge, and slowly but surely I lost the battle, my eyes closing as I drifted into a deep slumber. I don't know how long I was out for. It could have been minutes or hours, but I guess my sleepy interlude was long enough to allow sinister powers to work their dark magic. I do remember what I dreamt during that brief slumber, surreal but surprisingly vivid dreams which chilled me to my core. I saw my ex-wife in a dark place, beyond my reach, and suffering alone. Next, I found myself alone in the train carriage, running from the end to end, but finding no one who could help me. As my nightmare continued, I slammed my fist against the carriage door, screaming as I desperately tried to escape my rolling metal prison. But my efforts were to no avail, and I was trapped inside, alone and afraid. I was awake in an instant, gasping for air as I shot up from my seat. I scanned from side to side, somewhat relieved to find I was still inside the train carriage and had simply suffered a bad dream. I groggily adjusted my eyes to the harsh strip of light, noting how the brightness inside the carriage is compared to the darkness outside the carriage windows. The train was rolling past city streets, but not a light could be seen, not on the roads or any of the buildings. This struck me as odd, but I didn't dwell on it on that moment. Instead, I pulled myself off the seat and stumbled down the aisle in search of a conductor. My fear at this point was that I missed my stop and would end up stranded at a remote station with no means of getting home. That would have been bad enough, but even as I took the first cautious steps down the carpeted aisle, I felt that something wasn't right. Call it a sixth sense or a primal fear of terrors long forgotten, but I believed I was in a strange and hostile place. Glancing back and forth, I found I was alone in the carriage. This was disconcerting but not necessarily surprising, as I was riding a late night train. The interior was unremarkable, quite ordinary in fact. The blue upholstered soft chairs were set around plastic tables. Tannoy speakers and CCTV cameras were visible on the ceiling above me. I could hear the steady mechanical hum of the engine and the movement under my feet as the vehicle speed ever onwards, but where were we headed? I could not say. It was only then that I looked out the carriage windows, observing the darkness on the other side of the speeding train. I soon confirmed that there were no lights emanating from outside. None whatsoever. Every building and every street were shrouded in darkness, with the only illumination coming from the train itself. I couldn't see any cars or vehicles either. In fact, there were no signs of people on the outside, and it seemed like we were traveling through an abandoned city, devoid of life. How could this be? I asked myself. Perhaps there was a city-wide power cut. That was a possibility, but as I stood on the aisle and looked outwards, I began to feel increasingly uneasy as the scene rolling by changed for the worse. Whereas, before I saw tidy streets and well-maintained buildings, before long I was confronted by ruins and crumbling structures, a decaying urban landscape with weeds and vines slowly taking over the land. I was left gobsmacked, my jaw dropping and blood freezing as I observed an ever-deteriorating scene. I knew this city as its rundown areas, but nothing like this. I didn't understand what I was seeing or know where I was, and this uncertainty was truly terrifying. I felt so alone in that moment, like I'd been ripped out of the world and dropped somewhere dark, twisted, and bizarre, somewhere I didn't belong. Breaking myself from a fear-induced paralysis, I turned away from the window and slowly made my way down the aisle, heading for the doorway which led to the next carriage. More than anything in that moment, I wanted to find someone else so I wouldn't have to face this nightmare alone. As it happened, I did stumble upon other passengers, but unfortunately my new companions were just as confused and frightened as I was, and none of us yet knew why we were here, on board the fabled Shadowlands Express. And that was the end of the first part. I mean, so far, it's very, very... I don't know, is this guy from, like, the UK? Because gobsmacked, I rarely hear about that, except for, like, you know, from the UK and stuff. Not gonna lie, it's pretty good so far. Like, it gives you a sense of suspense, I guess. I don't know. I'm excited to see part 2 and maybe more parts. I actually don't know how many parts are there in this story. Well, let's continue. Part 2. The Passengers. Anna was the first person I stumbled across. I don't know whether this was by accident or design, but she was in the next carriage along from me, and I stumbled into her as soon as I entered through the connecting door. Anna was a woman in her early 30s, her appearance striking even at first sight, and I couldn't help but feel attracted to her despite the precarious circumstances. Her skin was dark and hair brunette, and she wore a striped business and matching skirt, which made me think she came straight from work. I noted how her mascara had run like she'd been crying, and her deep brown eyes were filled with passion but also fear, as she jumped up from her seat and glared at me with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded while backing up defensively. My eyes widened as I tried to understand why she was acting so hostile, but then I thought about it, realizing she was scared and had no idea who I was, and so I held my hands up defensively, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible whilst replying. "Take it easy, love. My name's Simon, and I'm just a passenger like you. Fell asleep on my way home, and now I'm trying to figure out what's going on." Their apprehension slowly faded from Anna's brown eyes, and her shoulders relaxed as she breathed a sigh of release. "Okay, I believe you," Anna replied slowly, speaking on the aisle as the train sped on past an increasingly bleak landscape. "My name's Anna," she confirmed. "I guess I'm in the same boat as you. Caught the last train home, fell asleep, and woke up alone in this carriage." She paused, looked fearfully outside the window towards the ruined city shrouded by darkness. I saw all this on the outside and thought I must be losing my mind. Either that or someone spiked my drink back at the bar. But you see it too, don't you, Simon? She looked at me hopefully, clearly wanting some validation. I glanced out at the carriage window, observing the same disturbing scene as the crumbling buildings turned into foundations overrun with vegetation. And it seemed the last vestiges of civilization were melting away in front of our eyes. I could no longer deny or attempt to rationalize away this terrifying sight because Anna was experiencing it too. I see it, I finally confirmed, nodding my head solemnly as I continued to stare into the abyss. Anna must have decided to trust me as she walked down the carriage aisle and stood beside me, placing her soft hand on my shoulder. Her touch brought me some small comfort in this chilling scenario, and I turned around slowly, looking into her expressive brown eyes and watching her soft lips as she spoke. Simon, do you know where we are? She asked nervously. I don't think Anna held out much hope, and I was destined to disappoint her. No, I answered solemnly. I'm afraid I have no clue. Anna broke out eye contact, removing her hand as she nodded. Well, we need to find someone who knows what's going on, she said with newfound determination. Let's search the other carriages, find a conductor who can help, or failing that, get to the driver's car and make him stop the train. Yes, okay then, I said in agreement, following the woman as we slowly walked towards the door leading to the next carriage. We didn't discover any train staff during our search, but we did find another 4 passengers, all of whom were in the same state of confusion and anxiety. First, there was Dennis, a wily and highly strung man into his 40s who was on edge from the moment we met him, ranting, raving, and threatening whoever had put us in this unfortunate situation. Next, we stumbled upon Zoe, a blonde-haired woman with fake nails and eyelashes, her face caked in makeup and her toned body clad in designer clothes. Zoe had a bad attitude and gave the impression she was above the rest of us. Jason was a better prospect, however, a tall and muscular man with short hair and firm eyes, and a steady smile. He spoke with some authority, which gave me an impression he'd been in difficult situations before and knew how to keep us cool in a crisis. And finally we found Eamon, a plump middle-aged man who not only seemed harmless but was also surprisingly unaffected by the craziness, shrugging his shoulder like this was all just a bit of bad luck. Personality-wise and in appearance, the 6 of us couldn't have been more different, but we were all thrust into this living hell together, and none of us had the slightest idea where we were or why we were here. We didn't find any of the staff members and couldn't get an answer from the driver's car, the door to which was firmly locked. Our phone were of no use either. Unsurprisingly, none of us had signal and the train didn't have a Wi-Fi. We walked the train carriage from end to end, trying to find something, anything which could help. The emergency lever was no use. We pulled it, but the train kept speeding on. Next, Dennis got the idea of using the glass breaker hammer. He promptly obtained the hammer, poising it against the window, ready to smash the safety glass, even though we told him it was pointless, as the train was traveling at a considerable speed. Dennis wouldn't listen to us, however, but before he could strike the blow, we were all startled by a disembodied voice calling out to us through the carriage speaker. Please, sir, I must insist you put the hammer down. Petty vandalism would not be tolerated. The voice was surprisingly polite, but at the same time authoritative, and more than a little sinister. I didn't think any of us knew what to think, but the mysterious voice captured our full attention, and even Dennis lowered the hammer and turned his head in astonishment. Okay, that was the end of the second part. This part was short and there wasn't any stuff to talk about. So let's get on to part 3. Part 3, the conductor. We all looked up at the tannoy, all frozen in shock as we waited for the voice to speak again. Now, sir, please set the hammer down on the table. There's a good chap. The unidentified male voice was being deliberately patronizing, and I didn't expect the dentist to react well, and so I was surprised when my fellow passengers meekly complied with the instruction, dropping the glass breaker down with a dull thud. A tense moment of silence followed before Zoe spoke out. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded. "And more importantly, where are you?" Clearly, her question was directed towards the anonymous man communicating through the tannoy. I considered this pointless as the speaker it wasn't a two-way radio, and so surely he couldn't hear us. But once again I was surprised, because the disembodied voice did answer.
Well, madam, I am the conductor, of course. This train, and you, the passengers, are my responsibility. And where am I, you ask? I'm right here where I've always been. Riding the Shadowlands Express. This train is my home and always will be.
His reply was cryptic and oddly chilling. I was left speechless while I was trying to understand the meaning behind the conductor's word. But Zoe talked back through clenched teeth. "There's no conductor on board the train," she snarled. "We've searched every carriage end to end." The conductor responded with a dry chuckle.
I assure you, madam, I am here. You may not be able to see my physical presence, but I can see and hear everything that occurs on board.
A cold chill went up my spine upon hearing those words. I think Zoe had a similar feeling, as her eyes widened in shock before she looked down at her expensive heeled shoes. Jason was next to speak out. I noticed how he'd picked up the safety hammer which Dennis dropped, and when Jason spoke, his voice sounded calm and composed. "Why have you brought us here? And what do you want from us?" Jason had asked what we were all thinking, though I certainly feared hearing the answer, but the conductor once again used cryptic language which was open to interpretation.
Good sir, I have not brought you here. You all boarded this train voluntarily. If you paid attention to the signs, you would have realized this wasn't a conventional service. But let me say this. Every one of you is here for a reason.
"The thing is, mate," Jason interjected, "we all just want to go home." He was right, of course, but somehow I doubted it would be that simple. There seemed to be some regret in the conductor's voice when he replied.
Understandable, sir. Very understandable. I wish it was in my power to bring each of you home right this instant, but alas, this is not possible. I can't guarantee the outcome of this journey, but I can promise two things. Firstly, none of you will be physically harmed on board my train. In these carriages, you're safe. Secondly, there's a path home for each and every one of you, but the journey will be long and arduous, and all passengers will be tested.
He let that statement hang in the air as the six of us shared a worried look. The fear inside that tight train carriage was palpable, and even Jason seemed uneasy. None of us really understood what was happening, but we all sensed the great danger. The disembodied conductor was the only one with any answers, but he wasn't willing to provide them, at least not yet. Instead, he signed off for the night.
I suggest you all try to get some rest. We have a long way to go and many challenges to face. You are free to move between carriages, but please do not attempt to exit the train. This is not physically possible and may result in injury or even death. I would also advise you not to look out the windows for long periods. You will likely be disturbed by what you see out there, but of course this is your choice. I think that's all for now. I will speak with you again tomorrow and provide details for your first test. Good night all.
With that, the speaker went silent, and the conductor would not answer, no matter how many times we shouted and screamed in an attempt to get his attention. Eventually, we settled down, sitting together in the middle of the carriage as we tried to come to terms with our insane situation. We talked for some time, exchanging outlandish theories on what this might be. The most persuasive argument was that we had been placed in some kind of twisted experiment, and perhaps we're hallucinating due to a psychedelic drug or gas. This seemed unlikely, but just about plausible. Other possibilities discussed include alien abduction or descent into purgatory. I found that the last option was particularly chilling. Were we all dead? I didn't think so. I felt alive and had all the same urges, feelings, and bodily functions. Thankfully, there was a functional toilet on our speeding phantom train. We had 3 plastic bottles between the 6 of us, which we could fill with water from the tap, except Zoe refused to share her bottle, and Dennis insisted on drinking straight from the tap. There was no food on board the train, however, and this would become a problem the longer our journey dragged on. The conductor had told us not to look out the carriage window. Good advice, but easier said than done. As the night went on, the ruined city was replaced by a dark forest, with tall trees on either side of tracks. This vast wooded area went on for miles and miles, and the forest wasn't empty. Every now and then we caught glimpses of dark shadows moving between the trees, large and unidentified creatures shaken from their slumber by the passing train. This was disconcerting, but worse still were the red eyes we occasionally saw, eyes burning in the darkness and glaring menacingly at our carriages, watching us until we sped out of sight. I can't speak for the others, but these sightings terrified me. I tried to avoid looking out the windows as much as possible, but my gaze was often drawn into the black abyss. It was Anna who made the discovery, which cast some light in our situation. She examined the ticket she bought at the station and found a message printed in the back. As it turned out, we all had a proverb or other communication written on the rear of our paper ticket, all unique and apparently personalized. We did not share our messages with the group, at least not on the first night, but I believe we were all shaken after reading those written words, perhaps even more so than the terrors we witnessed outside the windows. I can only speak from our own proverb, which read, "A false witness will not go unpunished, and whoever pours out lies will not go free." I struggled to control my emotions as I read those words again and again. I couldn't say for sure just yet, but I had an idea of why I was here. Alright, that was part 3. I mean, it's getting more and more interesting now with the ticket and all that stuff, you know. What do you guys think the train is going to? You know, like maybe they're going to hell and like they need to do something to redeem themselves because probably all of them did some fucked up shit in the past. We'll find out soon though. Let's get on to part 4. Part 4. The platform. None of us slept much that night. I did finally drop off due to sheer exhaustion, only to be plagued by dark and vivid nightmares. Awaking with a jolt, I found my companion still asleep, with the exception of Iman, who was looking out the window with an intense curiosity. I quickly noted that it was now morning, with the rising sun shining through the carriage window. I was relieved at first, as part of me had feared the morning would never come, but I felt less certain once I realized we were still traveling through a dense forest of seemingly endless trees, with no apparent sign of civilization. "It's been like this since dawn," Iman explained in the most wonderment without turning away from the window. "No towns, no villages, no people, no other trains or vehicles, just an endless track with trees on either side of us." He paused briefly to let those words and their terrifying implication sink in. "By my reckoning, we've been traveling between 8 to 9 hours at a constant speed of 50 to 55 miles per hour. We should have reached the coast an hours ago, but I guess the geography in this world is different than on ours." I felt a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach, my eyes widening as I stared at Iman in disbelief. Before turning towards the glass and staring out at the abyss, the vast forest wasn't quite as intimidating during the daylight hours. Nevertheless, there was an eerie quality to those towering trees, a surreal and almost mythical feeling that awoke something primal inside of me. As crazy as it sounds, I believe Iman was right. We weren't in the home countries anymore. In fact, the train seemed to have left our dimension, bringing us to another world with its own rules and unique dangers. Thankfully, we did eventually reach the end of the forest later that morning. Although our situation did not improve, the dense wood were replaced by miles after miles of rolling green hills, desolate, windswept, and seemingly empty moors set under grim gray skies. We didn't pass through any settlement during that long first day. The most we saw was the occasional stone cottage set up upon an isolated hillside. Most appeared abandoned, but occasionally we spotted figures standing behind the windows or in doorways, dead-eyed farmers and the family dressed in rags, and observing our train as it sped past, and all stood solemn in silence, like they were watching a funeral procession. Every 50 miles or so we passed the platform. Our train never stopped or even slowed down, and there didn't seem to be any point in these platforms existing, as they were merely elevated walkways with nothing of note anywhere near them. The first couple of platforms we flew past were empty, but a solitary figure was standing on the third, an elderly woman with disheveled white hair, wrinkled skin, and wearing a bloody red dress. I remember the cold chill I experienced when I first saw her, a deep terror which I could not fully explain. We all watched her in silence through the carriage windows, noting the twisted smile on her lips as she followed our progress along the tracks, lifting her arm to wave at us in an act of horrifying mockery. We called this woman the Hag, and we must have seen her at least a dozen times during our long journey. The hag always stood alone in the platform and watched our train roll by. Sometimes she stood in a silent vigil, or other times she smiled and waved, but the worst occasions were when the hag reacted with hostility to our presence, running along the platform with pure hatred in her eyes while screaming obscenities which we could not hear. I don't know whether it was the same woman every time or a series of doppelgangers. It shouldn't have been physically possible for an elderly woman to travel hundreds of miles in mere hours, but the recognized laws of physics didn't seem to apply in this world. The hag stopped appearing as we approached sundown, only to be replaced by an even more sinister figure. As the lights faded, we were confronted by a hooded man who stood upon the passing platform, a figure dressed from head to toe in dark robe with his face covered. We called this chilling entity the Harbinger, although I feared he might represent something even darker. We never saw his face as it was covered by his hood. Still, we sensed the Harbinger was closely observing our progress through this realm. And he wasn't alone. The Harbinger was always accompanied by a huge white dog, more like a wolf in actual face, which he kept on a tight leash. While the Harbinger always remained still and silent, his mutts barked manically at the train, struggling against the chain, her eyes burning with hatred and hunger, and with a maw-filled razor-sharp fangs. That day was filled with terror and paranoia, as my fellow passengers and I were pushed close to the breaking point. I don't recall all the conversations we had in between those terrifying interludes, but we tried to make plans but could find no solution. There was some talk of our lives back home, about families, friends, pets, hobbies, and jobs, about what we missed and wanted to get back to. Although some were more willing to share personal details than others, I saw the best and worst of my companions in those long hours. Jason revealed he was a former soldier, and he continued to try and take charge in the chaos. Although a practical sense, he was effectively powerless. Dennis was continually on edge and prone to angry outbursts, which made him increasingly unpopular with our small group. Zoe was much better. Spoiled and entitled, she kept insisting that she shouldn't be here, as if any of us had a choice. By contrast, Iman barely spoke at all, instead silently staring out the windows like he was mesmerized by the bizarre sights beyond the carriage. I began to think that Anna and I were the only sane people on board, and we continued to bond and become closer despite the extreme stress of our situation. We made several attempts to gain the conductor's attention throughout the day, frequently shouting into the speakers, but to no avail. The conductor ignored us throughout the day, only speaking to us again after dusk, when he communicated the instruction for our first test.
Good evening, passengers.
The conductor suddenly exclaimed, his chilling voice booming through the PA system. We all jumped up, startled by this sudden intrusion. "Where the hell have you been?" Dennis snarled angrily, but the conductor simply ignored him, continuing in what seemed to be a prepared script.
We will soon be arriving at our first stop. Your instructions are simple, but must be followed to the letter. All passengers must leave the carriage and step onto the platform. Once you disembark, you will find provisions waiting for you. Feel free to stock up on food and drink. When you have done so, you must stay on the platform and await further instructions. Do not leave the platform under any circumstances. I hope this is clear, and I look forward to welcoming you back on the carriage once this business is settled. Good luck.
That was it, the message in full, and the conductor wouldn't answer our frantic demands for further information. We wondered whether this was a trick, but sure enough, our train did begin to slow before it finally come into a halt beside a dimly lit platform. The carriage door shot open, but none of us moved an inch. Fear entered my companion's eyes as the cold air from the outside hit us. In a sense, this is what we all wanted. The train had finally stopped after a non-stop journey over hundreds of miles, and the carriage door were open, but still, none of us was in a hurry to disembark, not given the horrors we'd witnessed outside the train's windows. The conductor had given us clear and simple instructions, but how could we trust him? Still, there was an added incentive to step onto the platform. At the far end of the elevated walkway, we could see two vending machines stocked with crisp, chocolate, processed food, soft drinks, and bottled water. We had water on the train, but no food, and hunger was starting to hit home. We debated for some time over whether to disembark and eventually voted in favor of this action. As Jason put it, this conductor or whoever is running this thing, they hold all the cards. We need to follow their rules, at least for the time being. But sooner or later, they'll slip up, and then we'll have our opportunity. Jason was the first to step off the train, closely followed by Dennis and the rest of us. It was a cold night, and the chill hit us after the relative comfort of the carriage. I also picked up on a foul smell in the air, a stench which seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place. But our prime focus was on reaching the vending machine. We didn't need to insert money and could take as much food as we wanted. Once we tasted the produce and realized it wasn't poisoned, we filled our hands and bags with supplies, stocking up on as much as we could carry, because there was no way of telling how long we'd be trapped on board the Phantom train. With this task complete, we stood and waited, warily glancing towards the dark trees beyond the lit-up platform as we waited for further instruction. "What now?" I asked. I addressed my question to Jason. "We'll wait for orders, just like he told us," was his stern answer. "To hell with that." This was Dennis. His blood was up again, his eyes filled with something close to madness. "You need to calm down, mate," Jason said firmly while looking Dennis square in the eyes, but it was to no avail. "I won't calm down, no fucking way," Dennis screamed. "You people are all nuts. You wanna let that voice tell you what to do? Not me, mate. I'm stepping off and going home." "No, Dennis," Anna cried in distress. "You don't know what's out there." But Dennis simply scoffed dismissively. "I'll take my chances. No way I'm getting back on that fucking train." I moved towards Dennis, intending to be physically restraining him if necessary, but Jason stopped me from doing so, placed a firm hand on my shoulder and shaking his head in the negative. A moment later, and Dennis was off the end of the platform and sprinting into the forest, but he didn't make it far. We didn't witness our companion's grisly death. Thankfully, it was too dark to see, but we did hear every horrific detail as the slaughter played out in the blackness. First came the no animalistic growls, followed by a chilling scream from Dennis as he surely realized he'd made a terrible mistake. A violent rustling came from the bushes, Dennis continuing to scream frantically as the growling beast tore him with teeth and claws, ripping flesh and cracking bones. Mercifully, it was soon over, as Dennis stopped screaming and all we could hear was the sound of bodies slowly being dragged away. "Oh my God," Zoe exclaimed with tears of terror rolling down her cheeks. A moment of shocked silence followed before the speaker attached to the platform lamps burst into life.
The first test is now concluded. Please return to the train without delay.
It was the conductor's voice, and we all obeyed, quickly jumping back on board the carriage before the door shut and the train started to move forward, leaving a cursed platform behind. 6 of us had disembarked, and only 5 had gotten back on board. With the reckless Dennis devoured by the beast, we all sat in stunned silence for some time as the train sped on. Eventually, the conductor provided an explanation of sorts.
Alas, Dennis is no more. He merely needed to obey the instructions, but instead he tried to run. Perhaps not surprising. In life, Dennis was never held down by a job. He abandoned his wife and children, running away from what was always in his nature.
Then why test him? Anna responded angrily. You knew what he would do, so what's the point?
On the contrary, man, I had no prior knowledge of what Dennis would do. His actions may have been predictable, but Dennis had free will, as do all of you. You should bear this in mind during the trials to come.
None of us had anything to say to that, the five of us sitting in wordless and fearful contemplations as our grim odyssey continued. Alright, and that was the end of part 4. There's still 3 parts to this story, but I'm gonna leave the episode here. Let me know if you guys like this story, and I'm gonna come out with episode 2, which is the final part. Talking about part 5, 6, and 7, probably next week. Yeah. So far, this I like this better than the last one. You know, it's really eerie, and it started off being supernatural, so it didn't make the jump from creepy to supernatural, which I didn't like. But you know, I hope it keeps going on to be that good until the end. I mean, it is top rated in the last, I don't even know, this is top rated in creepypasta.com, so it should be good. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I wish you guys the best. Please like, subscribe, and comment about whatever you want to comment. You know, how's your day? How's my video? Is there anything to change? You know, tell me about your day in the comments. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.